All right, welcome to the Jump Music Initiative podcast. With us this week is an old buddy of mine, a really good friend of mine, Brenton, FreddyB, out of Edmonton, Alberta. And Freddie and I go back a long, long way. I'm not going to say how long, but longer than some of you listeners have been alive, that's for sure. So today we're going to get into talking a little bit about music production, but also just some of Fred's views on production itself, or songwriting, or being an artist in general, what kind of advice you can give to some young artists out there. So I think I might just kick things off here, Freddie, and just ask you, can you, in simple terms, define what a producer does for an artist, or why an artist would go to a producer, or what the role of a producer is, in just generally speaking?
Okay, starting with the hard questions first.
Well, I want to give everybody kind of you don't have to get too in depth. I just want to give everybody a general idea of why they might need one, or what somebody can do in a production role for an artist.
Absolutely. Yeah, the only reason that's a hard question is it's very, very dependent on the artist or the particular project, or maybe where the artist is or what they're looking to get out of it. The short answer of what a producer does is the producer facilitates the production of the music. And this is why I say that it can really vary depending on what a particular artist is looking for, or even what a particular project calls for. Let me maybe talk a little less generally, but generally about a few different types of scenarios. So a pretty common one would be an artist or a band, especially a younger artist or band who hasn't done a whole lot of recording, is at a point in their creative career where they are ready to sort of get into the studio and need a bit of help in terms of maybe even picking which songs. So like, this might be an artist that has written 20 songs, but they want to record 10 of those. So a producer can kind of help make those kinds of choices. Even in terms of in an individual song, like a producer could almost work as an arranger or give production hints at, like, this particular song could use a bridge, or maybe this is the type of song that we should slow down, or actually make changes to the creative and musical choices. You could also have a scenario where a producer is working with an artist who is primarily a singer, but maybe isn't a songwriter, and so a producer could also facilitate that. Maybe the producer knows other songwriters or is a songwriter themselves, and a good producer can often pair an artist up with the material that they're putting out. Sometimes a producer is just somebody who knows the ins and outs of a studio a little bit better. Maybe an artist maybe really knows what they want to sound like, but they don't have a lot of experience recording, and so a producer can work as an engineer or with the engineer to realize the vision of the band. So a producer, in short, if I'm going to try to sum that up again, it's really facilitating the production of the music. So a good producer will have a good ear for musical choices, song choices, and the recording techniques to sort of get to the end goal. And like I said, it really depends on a particular artist or particular project. Sometimes an artist comes with a vision and the producer is just really facilitating that vision. Or sometimes an artist would want to work with a producer because they know what that producer can get. Maybe a band has done tons of recording, but they want to work with a particular producer because of that producer's track record or body of work. And they want to sort of sound more like that, or utilize that expertise or experience. So yeah, sorry that wasn't maybe as short as
no, that was great. That was succinct. I think as succinct as you could be for such a big question.
Yeah, I certainly didn't want to say it just depends, but in so many ways it kind of depends.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask, on behalf of young people who may not already be musicians, but they want to get into the music industry, what would be your best advice for people like that?
Assuming the obvious, that they have an interest in sort of becoming a better musician, be it a guitar player, piano player, or whatever. So obviously practice your craft. Become as good a player as you possibly can. But I'd say some of the most important things that sometimes gets overlooked, especially when people are learning technique or they want to sound like a certain thing or whatever, is play with other people. Find as many opportunities to jam or to play with other musicians. You can go to school for music, obviously, like even at the university level or higher, you can study with the greatest in the world. But there's really no substitute for what you learn playing with other musicians at your level, under your level, or certainly above your level. I think, I mean, Jory's the same way, right? We went to university for music. I think we learned more in the years leading up to university and in the years working as musicians after university than even in school.
Right.
Definitely. I second that for sure.
And I don't mean just the obvious, like, so you learn networking and you learn all sort of other parts of the industry, but like I literally became a better musician by who I've played with and who I've listened to. Mm-hmm. So yeah, listen and play. Sounds kind of obvious, but.
So jumping back to an emerging artist, somebody starting out and they've never worked with a producer before, they've never gone into the studio. What do you think? I know it depends on the person, of course. But do you think that a good place to start is by recording a single or trying to record an EP or jumping right in and doing an album? What's a good way to start out? Let's say if you're a singer-songwriter, and then maybe if you're a band, or maybe it's the same answer.
Yeah. Okay. Those are two different. I think I have different answers for those situations. I think, and I've done lots of both as a producer. A lot of times, a singer-songwriter specifically wants to work with a producer because that singer-songwriter maybe only knows guitar and his or her own vocals or piano and vocals or whatever. And what they're looking at for in the producer is the rest of the band arrangement, or possibly even if it's, studio trickery kind of arrangement, like additions to something, right? Like anybody can rent a nice microphone and hit record and record singing a song into a tape machine or into a computer or whatever, but a producer will have all of those other elements that they couldn't do on their own. And that would be different in a band situation, right? A band could often have their songs well rehearsed and all of those arrangements happening, right? Like the guitar player knows what they're doing, bass and drums know what they're doing. In that scenario, I think a producer could either make some suggestions or, like I said before, can kind of make some song choice stuff. Mm-hmm. As a producer of a band who writes their own material, I always like that is if as a producer or even as the band has more material than what they want to record at that point. Because producers can make the choice, like, do you want to have a radio single or do you want it to be this kind of thing? And so right. That's where you're realizing the vision of the artist, right?
And I guess remembering the fact that, not all the songs are going to make it onto the album per se, or having more than you're going to record.
I think in both cases, that's good advice. Having more than you want to end up with, because then you just get to sort of pick the best, or at least, sometimes a project, especially if you're recording an actual album, a body of music, sometimes you want some cohesion there. And that 7th and 8th song might be really great songs, but they might not fit with the others or whatever. So maybe that's why you want to record a 4 or 5 song EP. So many of these answers could be, it really depends on the specifics, but
there's so many factors to it. Of course, like, this is not even taking into consideration things like budget, exactly. Anything like that, let alone your body of material. So yeah, sorry to throw such general questions at you, Freddie, but thank you.
It's okay. I get asked these questions a lot, so I should have these answers prepared.
Is there any producers that inspired you when you were first starting?
Yeah, so I think I got into production from a pretty wide, how do I say this? So I'm interested in multiple different genres of music. I like everything from old country to jazz to punk rock and hip hop and whatever. And so I think one of my early draws into it was how differently those musics are approached, not just musically, but certainly in the studio. There was a long time where I was nerding out on, drum machines and beat making and the whole hip hop sort of side of it, rather than live acoustic instruments. And then I think I saw the name come up more often than others in reading sort of like record liner notes. You may have heard of Rick Rubin, major player for decades now. But what's really interesting about Rick Rubin and his production history is that he's done everything from very early hip hop in the 80s to Red Hot Chili Peppers to Johnny Cash's last records. And his approach is not imparting his musical taste necessarily. He's really all about serving a song. He's really all about getting the best out of the artist. And once you start sort of like diving down all the different avenues that he's worked in, and there's other producers that could kind of fit that bill too. It's fascinating to me, or it was fascinating to me, that you can, what I hear in a Rick Rubin production is that you don't hear Rick Rubin. Like it's pretty transparent. You hear, and it's, the production is always as stripped down as could possibly be too. Like some of the later Tom Petty stuff and the later Johnny Cash stuff, it's as stark as possible. Yeah, it really serves the song and it really serves the artist. So no fancy production to get in the way of what's there in the song and the delivery of that song. So he's always been a hero of mine that way.
That's yeah, Rick Rubin, what a great example. Freddie, stepping away from the production for a second, because you're a multi-instrumentalist, you're a songwriter, you're a vocalist, you do all these things, and I know it helps you on the production side as well. But if we step away from that, and maybe you can offer some advice to young artists who want to develop their songwriting, or maybe some young musicians that haven't got into songwriting at all. How are some ways you can start doing that? What are some really simple approaches to starting writing some songs?
I think it's the same answer as like if you want to get better at playing an instrument. It's like think of it as it's a skill set, or think of it as like a muscle, and you need to work out that muscle. So no one's going to write their first 5 songs and have any of them be all that amazing. I don't think. I mean, young ones out there, prove me wrong. But I certainly remember writing a bunch of stuff that was just garbage. But sort of, you kind of got to get into the flow of what writing is. And then similarly to like learning an instrument, I'll use learning saxophone. Well, you're not going to learn saxophone by listening to classical piano all day long, right? You're going to learn you're not going to learn saxophone just by listening either. Obviously you have to practice, but I mean, it's something that it's kind of obvious on the musician side that if I want to play like John Coltrane, I should be listening to a lot of John Coltrane. So if you have aspirations to be a songwriter, I'm not saying you have to go listen to any particular songwriters, but start listening to music with the ear of what makes this an interesting song, or what was the process in writing this song. And I think that's just an active listening thing. And it isn't even to say that will become an influence on your songwriting. A really great example, and Jory, you know this, I'm a huge Elvis Costello fan. And I got drawn to his songwriting specifically. I just think he writes really clever words, and he kind of has a bunch of different genres that he writes in as well, and he's had a long career over many decades. But my songwriting approach is never, I mean, with maybe rare exception, is never really like trying to sound that way, or never really would sound like that. But he fascinates me enough to have that active listening. So I listen to like, why do I find this interesting? Oh, the second time the chorus comes around, it's a little bit longer, or this is the variation that he does there, or it's 2 full minutes into the song before it gets to this part that by the end of the song you're realizing it's the chorus or whatever. So it's learning what the repertoire of a songwriter is by sort of analyzing songwriters. Right. Is that do sort of that?
I think that's great advice, and really breaking down some of the arrangements and some of the, like, deconstructing the song almost, so that you see the different parts and recognize them as different parts, right?
For sure. If I was a real beginner, so like to simplify that even more, see if you can figure out, like, does a song have, so just musically, does a song have a structure? Is there like an intro, then a verse section, then a chorus section, and then does it come back to a similar section for a verse again, et cetera, et cetera? Or is it constantly changing? And then, of course, typically when we're talking about songwriting, there's a lyrical element as well. So just from a poetic standpoint, is it very wordy? Does it tell a story? Is it more about vibe? Is it just sort of painting abstract picture, or because there's different approaches there, you know, and I'm certainly not an English teacher or a literature teacher, but there's certainly different approaches musically, which, you know, I would be more inclined to talk about, but definitely different approaches lyrically. Some people are great at story songs. Some genres lend themselves better to different style of lyrics and stuff as well, right? If you're into pop music, sometimes the story isn't so deep. It just needs to make you feel a certain way. Or, you know, there's many genres like that. But
yeah, right.
I think the key comes down to, yeah, like taking the time to actively, like, I like this song, listen to it, and see if you can figure out what about the crafting of that song makes it interesting to you. And then try to write in that style, and then try to develop your own, right? Again, it's similar to me to like being an instrumentalist. You know, everybody who picks up a guitar when they're 13 years old wants to be whoever, Jimi Hendrix to John Mayer, or whatever the inspiration was. But eventually, you know, you become your own. You sort of put your own stamp on it. So I think the same thing would happen songwriting wise.
Cool.
That's some great advice, especially for, I think, for young artists going into the studio to know what they need to have prepared in terms of they have their songwriting done, but then arrangements. And if you want to expand on that, what are some things that young artists can do to be better prepared before they go into the studio?
That's a really great, I think you kind of nailed it there. The biggest thing would be to be over prepared. So we've already kind of talked about that, having more songs, more available. But also, depending on the production scenario, being open to change. I mean, something that most producers do, like say there's a studio time set. I know I'm going into the studio in 3 weeks with this band. I would hope to be able to attend a few rehearsals with that band and work out some of, I mean, what they call pre-production. It's called pre-production for a reason. Some of these things about like, okay, we need to make this song a little bit shorter, or it'd be cool if we added some shots at the beginning of this for some intro, or whatever the specifics are. But some of that can kind of happen before the actual studio. The biggest advice before you go into the studio is studio time is very expensive. So before you actually get in front, you know, headphones on in front of the microphone, make sure that those parts are as tight as you can get them and as close to what you want that final product to be. So yeah, in some cases that means working with the producer ahead of studio time, or at least being very, very, very well rehearsed, I would say is the best. And don't go out partying the night before, especially if you're the singer. You know, you need to have your instruments in top shape as well as your songs, right?
We find that out the hard way when we're young, don't we, Fred?
Yes, we do. All of this. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Can you? Let's talk. I just want to talk for 1 second about Kimberlite Records and your approach to production there. So Kimberlite is an old school soul label, and Freddie and I work on it together. But do you have a different approach in terms of, you work with a lot of analog stuff there? Can you talk about the difference between analog and digital? I think that some listeners might not even be aware of what the difference is between that, and then some of the characteristics of both, and why Kimberlite maybe uses analog, or you know, just to be aware of some of these different techniques and things that are available in recording.
Sure. I suppose the biggest difference between analog and digital is what you're typically talking about is recording to a tape machine, usually recording to tape. That's certainly the way it was done everywhere up until somewhere in the mid 80s. And then digital technology sort of caught up to be able to record at fidelity enough to release music, to record music. But yeah, the biggest difference would be two things. And this is up for a bit of debate, but a lot of people think that tape has a particular sound. And if you want to get deep into the science of it, sound is recorded to tape magnetically, and digitally what's happening is it's taking small chunks of sound, right? Like little clips of sound, so small that you don't hear any of those gaps in between when you listen to a song. But like most people watching this hopefully have seen a physical waveform in digital recording, and maybe not, but if you can kind of just picture a graph of sound from the beginning to the end, digitally what's happening is it's taking tiny little snapshots, And if you know about MP3s and quality of MP3s, you say it's like at 320 kilobits per second, or this is how many little slices are in there, right? So technically speaking, there's actually information missing. It's so small and it's happening so quickly that we, just like a film projector, right? You don't see individual frames, and you don't see individual frames in animation, visual animation, right? You see it as a smooth thing. The same thing, exact thing is happening when you're placing together all these tiny little digital clips. In the analog world, there is no clipping of it, right? It's actually a continuous sound. So there is some depth. There is literally information missing in that sound. So
I see.
You've all heard lower and lower quality MP3s, or even the sound that we're hearing right now, right? This is digitally degraded, and it's going out into the internet and coming down into Maddie's place and coming down to where you are. And so we're hearing not the highest fidelity sound. Well, that's happening to some degree in every sort of digital approximation of sound. Analog is a true full-on representation. The other thing that happens with analog gear is it's usually old, an old tape machine, or even old records, right? You actually have physical media degradation. So the tape isn't perfect, the vinyl record you're playing isn't perfect, but there is some charm to that sound, right? So lots of people describe it as a warmth, or sort of that, even that tape hiss, right? There's a charm to that. And that's one big reason why I think I'm drawn to that analog sound for Kimberlite specifically, because basically, like you said, we're doing an old school soul project. This label is very specific to an era of sound. And they certainly didn't have digital options back then. So we part of the appeal was we're doing it the same way that they did it in the 60s in Detroit or Chicago or whatever we're trying to sound like. The other kind of really cool thing that's that you get out of an analog or recording to tape is the straight limitations of how difficult editing is, how time consuming it is to even just rewind to the beginning of the song to try a take again. So what I love about it is it puts you in a different headspace creatively, or like in the moment of recording, or at least it always does for me. I've spent so much time editing in front of Pro Tools that if I have that option, I'm probably going to do it. And Jory, you even remember recently, like we recorded some stuff that we wanted to make it sound really old, and I'm still nudging things around and moving it so it sounds a certain way. You don't have those options really with tape machines, especially if you're recording multiple instruments at the same time. Sometimes it's hard to separate one from the other, and you certainly aren't, like they physically have to cut tape to make edits, right? So I'm not doing any of that. It puts you in a, like you better get that take, or you're also just accepting the little mistakes as part of the charm of the process too. So that's not why all people kind of go for that analog thing. Most of the time people will tell you that it's for the charm of the sound, or the warmth of the sound and whatever, but I really like the fact that it's pretty limited, and you kind of get what you get. And I just, as the musician recording to tape, it puts me in a different headspace. Like I better nail it. I really want to stay in it. I don't get to just try it again, or edit it when I screw up.
The really old school way to approach recording, with the pressure there, and yeah, it's on you.
Oh, it's certainly the way that it was back then, especially so the other half of what we do with Kimberlite is we're not trying to sound like big budget music from back in the day. There's like everybody's probably heard of Motown Records, that has a giant legacy as one of the biggest, soul and R&B kind of genres to come out of the States. But at that time, there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other labels and other artists trying to sound like Motown on such a lower budget that they didn't quite get there, but they created their own sort of charm. And I think that's the tradition that we're basically trying to play in.
Right. And if our listeners want to check out what we're talking about, what Fred's talking about, you can go to kimberliterecords.com and check out some of the tracks and some of the artists there. Do you have anything to add, Maddie?
I was going to ask if you have a favorite artist you've worked with, or a favorite project you've worked on as a producer.
Oh, wow. I lied. You saved the hard ones for last. Geez, I don't know. It's always such a pleasure recording with Jory that I don't think I could name.
I was going to say, Fred, you don't have to say me. You don't have to. It's okay. But I appreciate it.
No, Maddie, I don't know if I have a better answer there. They've all been great.
That's the best answer.
That's not true, but too many of them have been great for me to.
Yeah.
Well, I think, Fred, thank you very much for your time. Unless
My
Maddie,
pleasure.
do you have anything else on your list that you
No,
wanted to ask?
I think that's great.
Yeah, I think you offered us a really fresh kind of insight into production too. It's really interesting talking to different producers too, because of course everybody has their approach and their influences, and that all is part of their sound, you know, because they're just like artists and within their own right, and they have their own library of work and their own sound. So anyway, Fred, thank you very much for talking to us. We really appreciate it.
I'll just add this because I've literally watched both of these. They're on Netflix. I watched them both in the last 2 weeks, maybe even the last week. There's a great one about, actually, I don't think it's on Netflix. It was somewhere, Crave maybe. But if you can find it, David Foster, a documentary about David Foster that was absolutely fascinating. And there is a genius producer guy. Say what you will about him as a person. It was a fascinating documentary. And there's one about Clive Davis too. And Clive Davis is a very specifically cool producer in the sense that he was not incredibly musically hands-on, but he had sort of all those other ethereal things that I was kind of talking about matching the right artist up with the right song, or just sort of like hearing hits before they happened. But he wasn't such a hands-on, like he wasn't the guy writing with them or arranging with them, whereas the David Foster really was. But anyways, both of these documentaries, fascinating, and kind of shows two very different sides of, I mean, both of these guys are big name producers, but
and different producers from each other.
Very, very different from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in their approach, like quite different.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah,
the documentary.
I mean, they both ended up working with Celine Dion at the same time, but like their approach is incredibly different. I just found it really interesting. Check it out. It's just on my mind.
Cool. Well, thanks very much, Freddie. We appreciate your time, and it was really nice talking to you. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Nice to meet you, Maddie.
Nice to meet you too.
Okay. Thanks. Take care, Freddie.
Okay. Bye-bye.